genre can be a tricky thing, because we're often tempted to make that history appear more neat and tidy than it really is. In the case of mystery and suspense fiction, an example of this temptation is to make it seem like one type of the genre follows another type smoothly and instantaneously, and that the former type then just drops out of sight. In fact, the type of the detective returns, but as a figure for a new era. To be more precise, when many critical studies of mystery and suspense fiction tell the genre's history, they give the impression that after American hard-boiled detective fiction began to emerge in the pulp magazines of the 1920s, then the era of the classical detective, personified by Sherlock Holmes, was over. This impression is strengthened by Raymond Chandler's influential 1944 essay, The Simple Art of Murder, which revolves precisely around the way American crime fiction introduces a greater degree of realism into the genre. In doing so, Chandler argues, the work of authors like Hammett both improves upon and replaces what Chandler sees as the artificiality of the English country house mystery. In Chandler's words, Hammett gave murder back to the kind of people that commit it for reasons, not just to provide a corpse, and with the means at hand, not with hand-wrought dueling pistols, curare, and tropical fish. He put these people down on paper as they are, and he made them talk and think in the language they customarily used for these purposes. The issue here isn't whether Chandler is right or wrong to elevate Hammett above writers like Agatha Christie or Dorothy L. Sayers. Instead, the issue is that the way Chandler pronounces the death sentence for a certain type of mystery and suspense fiction makes it easy to assume that once Dashiell Hammett started publishing, all writers of classic puzzle mysteries, cozy mysteries, and golden age detective fiction simply packed their bags and went home. The truth, of course, is very different. Even after the advent of hard-boiled mysteries, some authors still wrote stories featuring traditional detectives. What's more, those traditional mysteries were still extremely popular with readers. Appreciating this fact is important for three reasons. First, the continued production and popularity of classical mysteries during what we might call the hard-boiled era reminds us that a big part of the genre's enduring success is its variety. Second, studying these classical mysteries enables us to celebrate the accomplishments of those who were so comprehensively dismissed by the likes of Chandler. And third, considering the work of authors like S.S. Van Dyne, Ellery Queen, Dorothy Sayers, and Ngaio Marsh allows us to explain why this type of mystery and suspense fiction continued to be so popular with readers, even at a time when the classical mystery seemed to be in danger of becoming outdated. With that last point in mind, I want to organize this lecture into two distinct but related halves. The first will focus on British writers, and the second will be concerned with American writers. Why? Because even though the work of these two groups of writers shares many similarities, I believe the reasons for their popularity are somewhat different. In order to understand the continued popularity of classical mystery fiction in a hard-boiled age, we need to consider the importance of social context. Let's begin by taking a look at the golden age of detective fiction, a phrase that is typically used to describe a type of mystery fiction that was at its height during the 1920s and 1930s. Note the words golden age. At a time when critics like Raymond Chandler saw nothing but moribund artificiality, others saw the puzzle mystery as reaching its peak during this period. What were the main characteristics of Golden Age detective fiction? Because this type of mystery is highly formulaic and often consists of an elaborate game played between the author and reader, it usually followed a clear set of rules. For the most part, these rules were implicit, but occasionally they were spelled out explicitly, as when Ronald Knox published what he called his Decalogue, or 10 Commandments, that were meant to guide writers of this type of mystery. Knox begins from the assumption that, in his words, a detective story must have as its main interest the unraveling of a mystery whose elements are clearly presented to the reader at an early stage in the proceedings, and whose nature is such as to arouse curiosity, a curiosity which is gratified at the end. Knox then goes on to enumerate a list of do's and don'ts for those writing such stories. These include rules like the detective is bound to declare any clues which he may discover, and the criminal must be mentioned in the early part of the story, but must not be anyone whose thoughts the reader has been allowed to know. Some of Knox's rules are humorous and are clearly meant to poke fun at the more outlandish examples of the genre, such as when he cautions that not more than one secret room or passage is allowable. Other prohibitions are simply bizarre, as when Knox states that no Chinaman must figure in the story. What Knox's rules have in common is the assumption that the writer of a Golden Age detective story is duty-bound to play fair with the reader. Because the vast majority of Golden Age mysteries are whodunits, critics like Knox insisted that authors are obligated to provide their readers with all the information they need to solve the mystery. Why? Not because readers were actually supposed to solve the majority of the mysteries they read. Authors were too cunning and misleading clues were too plentiful for that to happen on a regular basis. Rather, readers were meant to feel that the author had treated them fairly, so that they could derive even more enjoyment from a solution they couldn't figure out, but that still made sense. If you're familiar with the work of Agatha Christie, the vision of the detective story elaborated by Ronald Knox will have rung a bell with you. Christie is indeed the undisputed master of this type of mystery fiction. However, because I discuss Christie's work in other lectures in this series, here I want to focus on a selection of other writers who have also been described as the queens of the Golden Age: Dorothy L. Sayers and Ngaio Marsh. Although there were also very accomplished male writers associated with the Golden Age, such as Freeman Wills Crofts, Michael Innes, and John Dixon Carr, my selection also has the benefit of highlighting the extent to which Golden Age detective fiction was widely associated with femininity at the height of its popularity, both in terms of those who wrote and read it, and by both its fans and critics. It was this association, for example, that allowed Raymond Chandler to sneer in The Simple Art of Murder at flustered old ladies of both sexes or no sex and almost all ages who like their murders scented with magnolia blossoms and do not care to be reminded that murder is an act of infinite cruelty. Dorothy L. Sayers was born in 1893 and grew up as the only child in a comfortably upper-middle class and highly educated family. Her father, who was the headmaster of the choir school at Christ Church College in Oxford, reportedly started teaching Sayers Latin when she was 6. In 1912, she won a scholarship to Somerville College in Oxford, where she studied modern languages and medieval literature. Although at the time she graduated, women were not allowed to receive degrees from Oxford University, in 1920, she became one of the first women to receive a degree from Oxford when their policy changed. In line with her academic abilities and pursuits, Sayers once said that she considered her translation of Dante's Divine Comedy, the first volume of which was published in 1949, to be her best work. For our purposes, however, a more important date is 1920, when Sayers began jotting down ideas for her first detective story. The result was the novel Whose Body, which was published in 1923 and introduced the world to her serious detective, Lord Peter Wimsey. Wimsey went on to appear in 11 novels and several collections of short stories, as well as an unfinished 12th novel and in a series of more recent novels by Jill Patton Walsh. Wimsey has obvious similarities to the figure of the classical detective personified by Sherlock Holmes. Like Holmes, Wimsey is highly intelligent, enormously accomplished, and knowledgeable about a vast range of subjects. Unlike Holmes, however, Wimsey is unambiguously upper class, whereas Holmes's class identity remains unclear. He also has a tendency to appear foppish and foolish, something we could never accuse Holmes of being. Like so many aspects of Golden Age detective fiction, Wimsey was a somewhat polarizing and controversial figure. Some readers loved him, whereas other readers and many critics simply loathed him. In an essay entitled "Who Cares Who Killed Roger Ackroyd?", a famous, or infamous, depending on your point of view, 1945 attack on Golden Age mysteries that originally appeared in The New Yorker, the American critic Edmund Wilson dismissed Wimsey's appearance in the novel The Nine Tailors in the following terms. There was also a dreadful stock English nobleman of the casual and debonair kind, with the embarrassing name of Lord Peter Wimsey, and although he was the focal character in the novel, I had to skip a good deal of him. It appears that even Sayers eventually lost patience with Wimsey, just as Agatha Christie came to find Hercule Poirot unbearable. When Sayers introduced her other famous series character, Harriet Vane, in the novel Strong Poison in 1930, she apparently intended to use her as a way to get rid of Wimsey through marriage. However, Sayers became so entranced by the relationship between them that Vane and Wimsey went on to appear together in a number of other mysteries. Edmund Wilson once dismissed Sayers's writing as a whole by saying that I had often heard people say that Dorothy Sayers wrote well, but really she does not write very well. It's simply that she is more consciously literary than most of the other detective story writers, and that she thus attracts attention in a field which is mostly on a sub-literary level. In my view, Wilson is too harsh, but his comments do have the virtue of highlighting the fact that Golden Age detective fiction was an easy target for critics. Those very same qualities that readers love about the writing of a Dorothy Sayers, the dependence on formulaic elements, highly elaborate puzzles, circumstances that often seem to strain plausibility, are the very qualities that enrage critics like Wilson. But even though Golden Age fiction becomes dated more quickly than any other type of mystery and suspense fiction, it still has unexpected pleasures for the careful reader. In the case of Sayers, for example, although she's often thought of as an author who writes pure puzzle mysteries in the pejorative sense, that is, mysteries devoid of any real-world information, the reality is more complex. As we might expect from someone who wrote about a wide range of subjects over the course of her life, including Christianity, ethics, and feminism, Sayers finds ways to imbue her mysteries with social concerns. She addresses the subject of women's education and their role in society in Gaudy Night, the experiences of World War I veterans in The Unpleasantness at the Bologna Club, and the seamier side of the advertising business in Murder Must Advertise. Even if you aren't inclined to accept puzzle mysteries on their own terms, therefore, there are still good reasons to read and enjoy them, despite what critics like Raymond Chandler and Edmund Wilson might say. Comparing the career and work of Ngaio Marsh and Dorothy L. Sayers is interesting for several reasons. For one thing, Marsh was born and raised in New Zealand rather than the UK, which suggests that the appeal of Golden Age mysteries was international rather than being confined to Great Britain. Still, there was a lot about Marsh that was thoroughly British. From 1928 onwards, after studying painting and working as an actress in New Zealand, she began to divide her time between New Zealand and England. Her illustrious career and her contributions to British culture were recognized in 1966 when Marsh, like Agatha Christie before her, was made a Dame of the Order of the British Empire. Marsh considered theatre to be the great passion of her life. She acted in, produced, and/or directed many productions throughout her life, especially in New Zealand, where she played a major role in establishing a professional theatre industry. For our purposes, however, Marsh is most important for the 32 detective novels she published over the course of her long and productive career, beginning with A Man Lay Dead in 1934 and ending with Light Thickens in 1982, the year of her death. All of Marsh's novels feature the British police detective Roderick Allen. The vast majority of them are set in England, but a few take place in Marsh's native New Zealand. In general, the series follows the progress of Allen's career chronologically, includes details about his family over the years, and sees him rise from being a detective chief inspector for the CID at Scotland Yard to the rank of chief superintendent. Marsh takes some liberties with Allen's age. Though the series stretches nearly 50 years, Allen doesn't age that much at all. A striking thing about the critical response to Marsh's work is that, unlike so many Golden Age writers, she has not been subject to the same kinds of dismissive criticism about being old-fashioned, elitist, or too artificial. Why is this? One possible explanation is that Marsh's novels are, technically speaking, police procedurals with a police detective as their protagonist. But even a cursory examination shows that this can't be the reason, because Allen is actually much closer to being a gentleman detective in the mold of Lord Peter Wimsey. Like Wimsey, Allen comes from an upper-class family. Both have an older brother, who is a member of the gentry. Wimsey's is a duke, while Allen's is a baron. Even their family members are alike, especially their mothers, both in terms of their manner and in terms of their close relationship with their younger sons. And finally, the speech of both Allen and Wimsey is filled with slang and upper-class humor, even though Allen is fond of allusions to Hamlet in a way Wimsey is not. So if their protagonists are so similar, why didn't Marsh attract the criticisms directed at Sayers? The answer, I think, lies in Marsh's fondness for theatre. Several of the Allen novels take place against a theatrical background. Her 1935 novel, Enter a Murderer, for example, revolves around a murder committed at the Unicorn Theatre when a prop gun fires a real bullet with disastrous results. In a similar vein, and nearly 50 years later, her final book, Light Thickens, tells the story of a production of Macbeth at the Dolphin Theatre, in which a claymore takes off a real person's head rather than that of a dummy. What we're seeing here, I think, is Marsh making a virtue out of artificiality. Rather than minimizing the performative, almost ritualistic elements of a Golden Age mystery, Marsh accentuates them through her use of theatrical settings, against which the actions and motives of a small group of suspects come into sharp focus. Although it may seem contradictory, Marsh's embrace of artifice may have saved her work from being criticized as artificial. Even though Marsh continued publishing into the 1980s, by the time World War II broke out, critical consensus was building that the Golden Age mystery was past its prime. Why did the war intensify this point of view? Because it represented reality in all its brutality. Against this background, the puzzle mystery began to seem more and more irrelevant and outdated. When we bear in mind that this type of mystery rose out of the ashes of World War I, as it were, then in retrospect, we can see that the Golden Age of detective fiction was a product of that peaceful time between two devastating conflicts, although it may also have been influenced by nostalgia for the years before World War I and anxiety about accelerating social change. During this relative oasis of calm, tales of individual murders arguably were entertaining and meaningful in a way they could not be when war broke out once more. If this theory helps to explain the fate of the classical detective story in Britain, what about the United States? You could argue that a similar perception of a period of calm between the two world wars exists in the work of the so-called lost generation of American writers like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. But from the perspective of mystery and suspense fiction, that proposition looks much more dubious. For example, at the same time that Golden Age writers were hitting their stride in Britain, the US was experiencing the impact of Prohibition, which began in 1920 and ended in 1933. During this period, the rise of powerful gangsters like Al Capone was the inspiration for novels like Little Caesar, which was published by W.R. Burnett in 1929. In this context, the hard-boiled crime fiction that began to appear in Black Mask in the 1920s seems like a perfectly logical response to the social and historical context of the United States at this time. Against the background of Prohibition, mafia fiction, and the hard-boiled private eye, what could possibly explain the continued presence of the classical detective? The best way to answer this question is to examine the work of the American art critic Willard Huntington Wright. Before turning his hand to detective fiction, Wright had already enjoyed a largely successful career writing about a wide range of subjects, including philosophy and, above all, art, as in his 1915 book, Modern Painting, Its Tendency and Meaning. Wright had also published realist fiction in the style of Theodore Dreiser, of whom he was a great admirer, and ironically, he'd also worked as a book reviewer for the Los Angeles Times, where he was known for writing blistering reviews of detective fiction. Wright's road to becoming a writer of detective fiction was therefore somewhat meandering and was largely a result of financial necessity. In the mid-1920s, Wright approached Maxwell Perkins, Hemingway's and Fitzgerald's editor at Scribner, with an outline for a trilogy of detective novels that would feature Philo Vance, a snobbish and highly cultured amateur detective. The first novel in the trilogy, The Benson Murder Case, appeared in 1926 under the pseudonym S.S. Van Dyne. By the time the other two novels in the series, The Canary Murder Case and The Green Murder Case, had appeared, Wright had become one of the best-selling authors in the United States. Funnily enough, although Wright was delighted by his newfound financial security, he was also somewhat embarrassed by his success. After all, the reason he used the Van Dyne pseudonym in the first place was because he didn't want people to know that he had declined from writing respectable art criticism to peddling mass-market fiction. Reading the Philo Vance novels with this context in mind, their artificiality jumps out so strongly that they almost read like parodies. Given this artificiality and everything it implies about writing a highly self-conscious form of mystery fiction, it should come as no surprise that, like Ronald Knox, Wright also produced a list of rules intended to guide writers of detective fiction, again using the Van Dyne pseudonym. One of those rules reads, "A detective novel should contain no long descriptive passages, no literary dallying with side issues, no subtly worked out character analyses, no atmospheric preoccupations. Such matters have no vital place in a record of crime and deduction. They hold up the action and introduce issues irrelevant to the main purpose, which is to state a problem, analyze it, and bring it to a successful conclusion." But Wright is not parodying the conventions of detective fiction in the Van Dyne novels. Instead, like Ngaio Marsh, he's making a virtue out of artificiality. Everything about Van Dyne's novels, from their protagonists to their settings and their resolutions, are the very apotheosis of the classical detective mystery. And this is exactly the reason why they were so popular with readers. With this said, it's also important to note that many people hated the Philo Vance novels precisely because they insisted on flying in the face of reality. Dashiell Hammett, the personification of the hard-boiled school of crime writing, loathed Vance, as we can see from his scathing review of the Benson Murder Case, in which he says, "There is a theory that anyone who talks enough on any subject must, if only by chance, finally say something not altogether incorrect. Vance disproves this theory. He manages always and usually ridiculously to be wrong." Humorist Ogden Nash captures the hostility towards Wright's protagonist more pithily in his famous brief verse, "Philo Vance needs a kick in the pants." Given this hostility, why were the Philo Vance novels so phenomenally popular with readers? In our discussion of British Golden Age detective fiction, we argued that it was the relative absence of violence in the society at large that allowed readers to enjoy these artificial and elaborate mysteries. So, we might expect that the gangland violence that defined Prohibition-era America might destroy the audience for novels like those featuring Philo Vance. But obviously, this is not the case. Why not? Popular fiction in general, and mystery and suspense fiction in particular, have often been criticized for serving as a form of escapism, a way for readers to avoid the harsh realities of the world around them. For this reason, the concept of escape has gotten a very bad press that, in my view, it doesn't deserve. The success of S.S. Van Dyne's Philo Vance novels proves that escapism can serve a very important social function. In the midst of a society being torn apart by violence, the careful analysis, investigation, and solution of a single murder comforts readers. Why? Because it suggests that violence, despite all appearances to the contrary, can still be understood and controlled. Wright may not have set out to write novels that both spoke to and alleviated widespread social anxieties, but his lightweight and frothy entertainments did precisely that. Let's turn now to a brief discussion of our final example of the classical detective, Ellery Queen. Queen was both a character and a collective pseudonym of two cousins, Frederick Danae and Manfred Bennington Lee, whose real name was Emmanuel Benjamin Lepofsky. Between them, Danae and Lee published over 30 novels and several collections of short stories featuring Queen, beginning with The Roman Hat Mystery in 1929 and ending with A Fine and Private Place in 1971. The character of Ellery Queen was originally heavily influenced by S.S. Van Dyne's Philo Vance. He's snobbish, Harvard-educated, wealthy, effectively wears pince-nez glasses, and only investigates crimes that he finds to be intellectually stimulating. We can also see the influence of Van Dyne in what became one of the most famous elements of early Ellery Queen mysteries, the challenge to the reader. This consisted of a single page toward the end of the book when Queen would address readers directly and inform them that they now had all the clues they needed to solve the mystery. Could they do so? But revealingly, Danae and Lee later developed a much more critical attitude toward the character of Philo Vance. Lee once described him as the biggest prig that ever came down the pike. This seemingly throwaway comment is in fact the key to explaining the enduring success of Ellery Queen. Unlike Wright, who felt trapped by the Philo Vance formula and felt that he had no choice but to produce more of the same, Danae and Lee were both willing and able to change the character of Ellery Queen to suit the changing times. Not unlike the dime novel character of Nick Carter, whose protean career took him from a clean-cut and young dime novel detective in the 1880s to a hardcore government assassin in the 1960s, Queen underwent a series of evolutions. These changes not only extended the life of the character, but also allowed him to expand into a variety of other media, including radio, television, film, comics and graphic novels, and even board games. And yet, despite these changes, Ellery Queen always remained a problem solver, the one capable of untangling and solving complicated mysteries. Thanks to their canny ability to combine change with consistency, Danae and Lee not only made Ellery Queen a household name, but also demonstrated there will always be a demand for the classical detective, even as the world around that figure continues to change. In doing so, Danae and Lee's work demonstrates what we have seen throughout this lecture, that the figure of the classical detective both persists and even flourishes in the genre at a time when his hard-boiled cousin attempts to shove him off the stage.